Finally, we're ready. Thank you for coming. I appreciate that. And finally, we get to meet the man I've been talking about, Reverend Don Wagner, who has spent 4 decades in the Middle East, and he has his new book out. Let's see. Here it is. Look at this. Glory to God in the lowest, journeys to an unholy land. Not the words we would put in the blank. So I'm honored to introduce you to our peace and justice activist, a Presbyterian minister, and an author, Reverend Don Wagner, right here. After 40 years of activism in the Middle East, an imam told him to return home and tell what he has seen. The imam said, "Go back and tell the truth." So here he is to do just that. And here we are, Reverend Wagner, to hear and listen about your experiences and learn. Thank you for coming to us, and let us welcome him now.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just sit up here. Maybe I'll just pull this in the middle, and we're going to be very informal. Thank you all for having me. And it's, to hear the sermon this morning, I knew that I was in a safe space to go into what I'm going to talk about. And it'll be, in part, some concerns about the recent election, just as the pastor shared, and then bridge that into my journey, which you will see leads into some concerns as the Middle East plays into this. Do I need the mic? Can you all hear me? Yes, what? Oh, right. I forgot about the Zoom. Yeah, sure. Okay. Remind me now if I drop it, I'll often drop it. Okay. Now, I know that many of you are familiar with the name Reverend Naim Atik. Yes. How many have heard of that name? Oh my. Evidently, Naim served here part-time while he was in seminary. Yeah, right here. And he is one of my mentors. So I'm going to come back and talk about him in a little bit and the whole issue of Palestinian liberation theology. Okay? But the place I'd like to start is my wife, who happens to be Palestinian and relatively secular, is addicted to the news and MSNBC. And I can only take about an hour of it, but she will watch one show after another. She'll go from, right on through Lawrence O'Donnell and even into the evening, back to back. So I don't have to watch it. All I have to do is ask what's the latest. But she keeps asking me this question: why are these Christian nationalists so hateful and so abusive? How do they get that from the Bible and from Jesus? So I've tried to answer her, but she keeps asking it, so I'm not doing very well with my answer. So I just want to start from that perspective with this whole issue of the white nationalism. And you know the name Marjorie Taylor Greene. Marjorie has said this before the elections: we need to be the party of nationalism. And I'm a Christian, so I say it proudly. It should be a party for Christian nationalists. Right straight out in the open. Now, I have a sister who fits pretty close to that, but maybe not quite as extreme. And her husband is a little bit more militant than she is. So how do we love each other as a family and really hang together? So we have decided to shelve this issue when we're on the phone and when we're together. Now, she's just gone through a cancer operation, and what I'm thankful for is she constantly calls me for counsel and guidance. So as Christians, we have that bond, thankfully. And I've stopped trying to change her or to convert her to my way of thinking, but we can love one another. And maybe, we'll just have to agree to be different. So that is one part, but I have several in my family who come from that background. In a moment, I can tell you how that happens. Well, a few things about Christian nationalism. It seems to be driven in many ways by a type of Christianity that some call evangelical. I think that is the wrong term. I was an evangelical, and in many ways, I'm thankful for that. I grew up with a deep commitment to a personal relationship with Jesus, kind of even a born-again experience. And we were deeply respectful of the clinic. We were into the Bible, and initially I believed it quite literally, and then I saw through seminary different ways to interpret and whatnot. But I'm thankful that I've had that biblical background. And have you had trouble hearing? Okay. Yeah. Maybe come up closer. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there is an echo. Yeah. Well, anyway, yeah, come on up closer. Yeah, have a more intimate fellowship. There's a whole pew open here. Yeah, or right up front here. For anybody. Oh, I don't know. Okay. Well, I forget where I was. Uh, evangelical. The term evangelical is an umbrella term. It's used to cover more conservative movements in Christianity, and it has grown to become one of the largest bodies of Christians in the United States. But there are different tendencies in evangelical. There are the fundamentalists, extremists like Marjorie Taylor Greene, and then there are other fundamentalists, like I don't know if you know the name Reverend John Hagee, who's a Christian Zionist. I'll talk about that in a moment, which would be a very extreme form of fundamentalist, strict, literal interpretation of the Bible, but they take passages selectively. It's like cherry picking a different theme. Then there's a very left and progressive evangelicalism, like Jim Wallace. There's many sojourners. Many young people now are breaking away from evangelical, but they're gravitating to more justice. They're involved in Black Lives Matter. They're involved in housing for the poor, very dedicated to justice issues. And in fact, there was a recent poll that was done by Pew that said about it's moved to over 20% of evangelicals in the under 30 no longer want to use the term evangelical because they feel it's been just abused too much with the wrong interpretation. So I just want to say that this Christian nationalist is an extreme form of right-wing fundamentalism, okay? And it's very binary, it's very good versus evil, and often misses what love is. They talk about, there's another theme in it, this is very elementary, I'm beginning to write and research this issue, so what I'm saying here is just very introductory. They have a thing that has been around a while called spiritual warfare. No, it isn't Jesus. But I understand your explanation there. Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, this is heavy duty, serious stuff. They actually believe that there are demonic forces, even interplanetary demonic forces, and QAnon picks up on some of this. And some of them will say that, like, Biden and the Democrats have been infected by these demonic forces and are evil. Who knows if that didn't drive the person behind the attack on Pelosi, Mr. Pelosi. But it draws out this kind of binary good versus evil and even hateful thinking. Often the prosperity gospel works into this movement, which believes if we really believe and trust God, we will be wealthy and God will provide for us. So this is, they just kind of jump over Jesus and cherry pick things. Or twist Jesus into their very form of reference. It's an extreme form of nationalism, wanting to turn the clock back, and it's very racially motivated. You will find occasionally some black folks or Latina involved in it, but there is at the base, I believe, a very deep sense of racism, because there's a fear that this country is changing. We will be, the minorities will be the majority in the mid-30s, if not earlier. So there's that kind of fear, wanting to turn the clock back. And it's very romantic in thinking that, well, we'll go back to the founding fathers, but they forget that many were slave owners and things like that. And it wasn't so romantic. But there's also very much a war mentality, that we will go to war, even civil war, if it's necessary. So those are some of the extreme views in it. Now, to connect dots, there's also what's a strong element of Christian Zionism. How many have heard that term before? Okay, a few. This is, again, there's various forms of it, but I'll just describe one and then switch to my own journey, because I grew up with it. So Christian Zionism is basically finding a Christian theology and rationale to support political Jewish Zionism. And Jewish Zionism goes back to the 1880s, 1890s, when there was a movement, and it was a reaction against anti-Semitism in Europe. When I used to teach Middle East politics and deal with the Palestine issue, I would give students an assignment the very first day of class in that course. I would say, write down for me when the Israeli-Palestinian struggle begins. What date? Where does it begin, and why? Now, if you had to do that exercise, what would you say? 1948? That's a good start. Where would you go back to? That's very good. Now, I mean, textbooks start in 47, 48, many of them, but they miss the colonial role of Britain and the US before that, bringing in the settlements with the Balfour Declaration and everything else. Balfour Declaration was British, and actually Lord Balfour was a Christian Zionist. He grew up in this end-time theology. Well, I guess I should hold this closer. I would go back and start the conflict in the 1880s, 1890s. That is when Jews were being persecuted, many by Christians, in Eastern Europe. The pogroms. There was a famous physician in Kiev, I think it was, or it was in the Ukraine, and he was the physician of all the people, and he was an assimilationist Jew. His name will come to me in a moment. And he was respected, was wealthy, but then when the economy began to collapse and the Tsar turned the people against the Jews and blamed the Jews, his home was burned. He switched almost overnight and did a pamphlet, and it was titled, his theme was Judeophobia. Europe is fearful and hateful of the Jewish people. And he decided we will never be safe in Europe. So the movement grew and continued, and Zionism was founded actually in 1897 by Theodor Herzl. But it was very much a secular political ideology to establish a home. Initially, he said home for the Jewish people, supported by the international and guaranteed by the international community. So that was the original formula. And Herzl and those around him were open to anything. So the British offered Uganda. There was even discussion of Arizona, really. And Herzl initially was open, but the people around him said, no, it has to be Palestine, because we have that heritage there, and also it will be useful for us in getting Christian Europe to support us. So they decided it had to be Palestine. And there was a theme that was going around that was started by evangelical Christians. In 1841, Lord Shaftesbury, who was a lobbyist with Parliament in England, he wrote in the London Sunday Times an article on why the Jews should be brought back and England should play a role in their return. And if they do, England will be blessed, and then the Messiah will come back if the Jews return. So you see, there's that end time theology. And his phrase was a people of no country for a country of no people. Now think about that. A country of no people? 94% of that country, by a Turkish poll done in the 1890s, 94.5% of that country was Palestinian, Christian and Muslim. 5% Jewish, none the rest internationals. So that country was populated. But there's this theme, there was nobody there, so we'll take it. And this is what drove the explorers, called the Doctrine of Discovery. Have you heard of that? The Doctrine of Discovery was a papal edict issued in the 15th century, I think it was, saying that you explorers who go out in South America, North America, you can claim the land for the Pope and for the church, and then you can go and convert the natives. But the idea was there was only the natives there, and they were like nobody. We can just go claim it and take it over. So these are some of the things that are going on in the background. So Zionism evolved in the 1890s out of that kind of a context. But it had this idea that there was really nobody there. Herzl was even informed. There were Palestinians there. They were the 90% majority. But they still adopted that phrase and turned it into a land of no people for a people with no land. A people with no land? Yeah, true. But it isn't like there was nobody there. So this is, in a sense, the idea that drove Zionism in its early days, and this is where the conflict begins. It doesn't begin in Palestine. In fact, Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived together peacefully. They would go to each other's holy days. They would celebrate and congratulate each other during Ramadan or Easter, Christmas, or the high holy days like Rosh Hashanah and the Feast of the Tabernacles even.
So they lived together peacefully. There would be squabbles and conflicts, but it wasn't political. But once Zionism began to settle, it really played a major role. And Christians, this Christian Zionism provided both a normalizing support for that colonial settlement and justification for it. So now a little bit about my background. So I grew up in this end time theology. And I'll just say a few words with that, and I want to watch the time and leave for questions. When do you usually wrap up on these? Because, pardon me? Oh, by 1. Oh my gosh. Yeah, we'll make it earlier. Some of you may want to get home and watch football or something. Okay, so I grew up in during the Cold War. In fact, my dad went off to fight in World War I when I was 6 months old, and I didn't see him for 3 years. So my mom moved back to the farm where she grew up in, and I was raised by my maternal grandparents. Grandfather was a Norwegian immigrant and a farmer, and my grandmother, basically a homemaker, and she watched me most of the day. And they were very nurturing, loving Christian people. And, you know, people of the earth, very simple, not that much money, just barely getting by. And I would then always go back to that farm. And I remember going back when I was about 6 or 7 years old, and I would roam around the farm, maybe help out a little bit, but mostly probably be in the way. And my grandparents at 8 o'clock every night stopped everything and did Bible study and prayed for everybody. The prayers were quite long. And so one night they said, well, we're not going to do Bible study tonight. We're going to go to a revival. So we drove down to this little country church. We were a little bit late. We got in the back row. And the preacher was in the last day of a series, and he was a massive person. He was a former professional wrestler who converted to Jesus. About 6'5", as I remember, easily 300 pounds. Just a massive guy. And his voice was a little hoarse because he had been preaching every day for 5 days. So it was even a little creepy. So it was a July day, and even in Buffalo, it gets hot. It was hot and humid, no air conditioning, so we're sweating and everything. So he started painting this picture of the end times, that the Antichrist was now alive. This is the devil's emissary in this end time theology, who was on earth and was organizing the world against Israel. He said, how do we know this is happening? Because Israel was just established. This was 1949. Israel was just established as a state. And the way they read the Bible, we're now in the countdown to Jesus' return. And among the signs were Israel established as a state. Well, that just happened in 48. Then next will be Israel controls all of Jerusalem. Now that didn't happen till, anybody know when? 67, yes. So we are in those end days, but the Antichrist is alive. So these preachers would always speculate, okay, who's the Antichrist? And in those days, you can probably figure out, it was the Soviet Union. So this fed Cold War ideas, very clearly. So he preached that sermon, and toward the end, he said, now I'm going to give you an altar call in a moment where you have a chance to make your commitment to Jesus. But I want you to know that there's something that is going to happen in the timetable called the rapture. How many have heard of the rapture? About everybody. Okay, so the rapture works this way. And it's from 1 Thessalonians 4. They just pick this out of the Bible. And it's metaphorical language, but they talk about it as a real event that's going to happen. That Jesus will call the born-again Christians up into heaven. They will be removed from earth. There's a whole series of novels that were bestsellers, made the New York Times, called the Left Behind series. Remember? Not long ago. This stuff is very deep in our culture. So he said, now I want everyone to stand, and I want you, if you have not made a commitment to Jesus, to make a commitment in your heart. So I was getting kind of scared, so we stood up. I made a commitment. Okay, I believe in Jesus. Please save me from what's coming. Something like that. I can't remember. And then he said, now I want you to come forward and receive a blessing from him. Well, I was so scared and embarrassed, I didn't go forward. So we drive home, and I went right to bed, but I didn't sleep well that night. On the farm, all the cats are screaming and the screech owls and all the noises. That added to me being spooked out. But I must have fallen asleep, so I got down to the kitchen maybe about 11 o'clock and came into the kitchen, and Grandma wasn't there as usual. So I pulled out my bowl of Wheaties and started eating. Then I wondered, well, geez, where's Grandma? So I go out in the back. Maybe she's getting tomatoes and lettuce from the garden right behind the house. She wasn't there. And I looked over to the cherry orchard, 50 trees. The workers were all out there the day before in the trees picking cherries. And the ladders were in the trees and nobody was on them. So I began to worry. I ran down to the barn to see if Grandpa was fixing the tractor. He wasn't there. And then I realized, my God, I didn't go forward. I didn't do it right. Grandpa and Grandma have been taken up into heaven. How am I going to run this farm at 6 years old? And I literally knelt in the driveway and looked up into the heavens to see if people were rising up to Jesus, and started to cry. And then I heard Grandpa and Grandma. I heard their voices. They'd just taken lunch over to the sick neighbor next door. I ran and gave them a hug, wiped my tears away. So that was my rapture story. But you see the fear that's in that. And it just selectively picks verses, and it jumps over God's love in Jesus. That's why I kind of use this title, kind of abusing Jesus in God's name. This is what you find in a lot of this theology. Well, I pulled out of that belief, and then and this is all in the book, and I'll come to that in a moment. And then I went to seminary. My senior year in college, I didn't know what I was going to do. My plan was to play professional baseball. Well, I did very well, but I wasn't that great, and I finally realized it, that I had no future doing that. I could go into coaching, or I could go to seminary. I was kind of toying with it. I never wanted to be a pastor. I always resisted that idea because I remember sitting around the table after church and kind of roasting the pastor, and I didn't want to be part of those expectations. So a couple of my friends, I had always toyed with the idea, and a couple of my friends were going to seminary. So I went. And I absolutely loved it. I went to a small Presbyterian seminary, Louisville, which was a wonderful experience. And I realized I love theology. And I then said, well, I want it was a small school, so I transferred to Princeton. And this would be about 1966. And of course, you know what was going on then. Princeton, not a radical campus, was, anti-war speeches, and it was really so I got involved and listened to those. Now, my dad was the treasurer of the Republican Party for Western New York. a military guy, and he was campaigning for Goldwater in '64. And I was really apolitical. If I had voted, I didn't even vote in '64, and I was just 21. I would have voted for Goldwater because I kind of bought into the domino theory and all that. Continuation of the Cold War idea. So I was won over gradually by the anti-war. Then a bunch of us students, university and Princeton seminary students, went down to an anti-war conference in Washington, D.C. It would have been March '67. And the lineup included William Sloane Coffin, the chaplain at Yale, tremendous anti-war voice. Andrew Young, who later became ambassador to the UN. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Hetzel, one of the leading rabbis strong on the anti-war movement, and Martin Luther King. Those were the speakers. I got my theology and I was convinced. And then when I told my dad where I was, he didn't talk to me for about a month. That ironed out later on. So then I got very involved in the civil rights movement. And here I am again, my senior year in seminary. I interviewed with 3 different Presbyterian churches and just couldn't see myself in any of those. I had been working weekends in a black church in Newark, East Orange, New Jersey, and just found that to be an amazing experience. And I was filling out an application. I didn't like the churches, so I said, well, I'm going to go on and get a PhD in theology at Princeton. So I was filling out my application, and I had a phone call, and it was from Joe Roberts, who was the pastor I was working with. Now, this church was amazing. He had only been there 3 years. The church had quadrupled in size. They had a choir, 55-member choir that recorded, and they said, well, we can do We Shall Overcome, Stand By Me, and Bach and Beethoven, and they did it in the same concerts. People would come just to hear this choir. So this church was an amazing place. And then Joe says to me, Don, you're sitting down? We want to call you to be our first associate. Oh, I still tear up that was so moving and amazing. Me, a white guy, still trying to figure it out. So I said yes immediately and went and spent another 4 years at that congregation. Worked through a lot of the white privilege issues, racism, and that congregation was so loving and so patient. And I got involved in a dialogue with Black Panthers. It was an amazing period then. And I came to the belief too that as a white person, I will always be struggling with racism. I believe it's an addiction that we always have to be conscious of, and often have Black folks help us. But we need to have that consciousness and awareness all of our lives, because it's something that I think is so deeply ingrained, at least for me. So anyway, I was very pro-Israel at that point. I came out of seminary with having done Holocaust studies, with a deep commitment. I will always stand with Jews when anti-Semitism rises. And our church twinned with a synagogue, our Black church, because there was some very real anti-Semitism in the community, because some of the store owners had overcharged Blacks, so as a resentment, their stores were burnt down in the riots of '68, and we were right there. So anyway, so we had that, and the rabbi would always tell us, we need you Christians to stand with us against anti-Semitism. And you black folks, we were there for you in civil rights, and you need to be for us. Stand with Israel. So that's the message I got. Well, then I took another church. I left that church. Joe Roberts, by the way, got a call. He became the senior pastor of Ebenezer Baptist, the King Church in Atlanta. Yeah, he was an amazing preacher. So I got a call to a church in Evanston, Illinois, north of Chicago. You know it? You know Evanston? So I arrived, and I remember driving across country in October '73. What was going on? Sorry? Yeah, Nixon, yeah. Think Middle East. '73 war followed by the oil embargo. Okay, so I remember stopping at a rest stop praying for Israel because they were losing that war the first 3-4 days. That's how committed I was. So then I get to the church. I was a young guy in a large church. It was just 5 blocks from Northwestern University. And so I was in charge of youth ministry, adult education, and church and social concerns. So my first meeting was with the Church and Society Committee in the adult ed. And as you said, we're in gas lines. Remember? Some of us who are of that age remember the gas lines. So we were trying to figure out, well, what should we do for a course that would be adult ed and social justice related? So a guy popped up and said, let's do a course on the Israeli-Arab conflict and focus. And he said, everyone's angry as hell at the Arabs, so maybe people will come out to try to figure out what's going on. And then he said, and for a change, as a church, let's do it from the Palestinian perspective. Now, he made me a little nervous because here I was very pro-Zionist. So then I said, okay, well, we need to be balanced. Now I believe that is a myth. In this conflict, Israel holds most of the cards. There's no balance in this conflict. I didn't know that then. So I said, okay, let's alternate. So since I was speaking out for Israel, the committee said, okay, you bring in the Israeli speakers to me. The other guy, Bill, a fundraiser at Northwestern, would do with another guy, the Palestinian and other Arab speakers. So I brought in the Israeli Consul General for the Midwest for the first Sunday. I got the big guns out first. And he gave a passionate defense of Israel, the little David, surrounded by the Goliath, the hateful Arabs, and we need you Christians to stand with us because we are always facing annihilation, possibly anti-Semitism, and we need you in this country in particular. So I felt good. He did kind of what I expected. The next week, Bill brought in a fellow by the name of Dr. Ibrahim Abalugod, a Palestinian. He was chair of political science, a real scholar at Northwestern University. He told the story of how he, as a teenager, fled Jaffa in 1948, right after Israel's declared a nation in what the Palestinians called a Nakba. It was a death march. They lost everything, had to flee their homes, many were killed, and in fact, half the Palestinian population, about 750,000, were driven out of Palestine during the next year and a half. Palestinians call it the Nakba, the catastrophe. I had never heard this. I was an avid reader of the New York Times, listened to NPR, studied. I had never heard of the Nakba. So it kind of jarred my narrative a little bit, but I wasn't fully a believer yet. Then I go into the office on Monday morning, and my first phone call was from 2 Holocaust survivors from Skokie, next door, a majority Jewish area of North Chicago. And they said, "Are you Reverend Wagner?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Are you the organizer of this course?" I said, "Well, with a committee, we all were involved in this." They said, "This course needs to stop. In fact, we will be checking on Wednesday. If this course is not stopped, your church will be picketed on Sunday morning, and there will be an article because you have dignified the position of a PLO terrorist in your church." Wow. So then they hung up. So I ran down and told my boss, the senior pastor, he said, "Geez, Wagner, you've been here, what is it, 2 weeks?" And we all, he was kind of joking, I think. So we went into the sanctuary as pastors with a backup plan, but the staff decided we are not going to cancel that course. We're going to stand with it. I'm grateful for that. And then word spread. The controversy tripled attendance within 2 weeks. And by the end of the course, the room was packed because people wanted to hear. So the course went on. And I got a real education. And then eventually I began to meet with Dr. Abelugod and a progressive Jewish leader. And they said, "You've got to go and see for yourself." So I saved up my money and went for the first time. I think it was I can't remember, 77 may have been. I waited a couple years, made my first trip alone, and was hosted by the Middle East Council of Churches. And I remember arriving in Beirut airport, and in those days it was absolutely chaotic. I got on the phone to phone my host, Gabi Habib, who was the new head of the Middle East Council of Churches. It rang and rang, and this is all in the book, and nobody answered. I mean, I talked to him just 2 weeks before. He said he would be there. It was 11 o'clock at night. I don't know anybody else in Lebanon. I started thinking about a hotel. And finally, I called again, and finally somebody answered, but it wasn't Gabi. And they said, "Oh, just come, get a taxi." So I wandered over, I jumped in a cab and made sure they spoke English. And it was 2 Palestinian guys, one guy in the front and the driver. And they sped down the road. I don't know if any of you were at the old airport in Beirut, but it was a long road. And there was a refugee camp, Burj al Barajne, on the right. And we came to I think it was the Lebanese army, to a checkpoint. This was the first lull in the civil war in Lebanon that lasted more than a week. They had been fighting each other. So the Lebanese army was the first checkpoint. They shined the light on you. They passed my passport up. The driver said, "Oh, he's going to AUB for graduate school." And then they apologized, said I lied, because everybody was coming to AUB. So when an American passport, he said, "That's the easy way to get through." Then we go about 5 more blocks, another checkpoint with the Syrian army. They had been fighting the Palestinians in the refugee camp, but there was a truce. Same thing. Now we go to another checkpoint, and finally the driver turned around and said, "Oh, I see you're from the United States." He said, "Yeah." I said, "Where are you from?" I said, "Chicago." He said, "Oh my God, Chicago, it must be dangerous there." He said, "Al Capone, shoot him up." Here I am in the middle of the Civil War, in a truce, and you're telling me Chicago's dangerous. So I'll never forget that incident. So eventually I got there, and I saw the refugee camps, and I began to see the United States from that perspective, and the role we played, and the role Israel was playing, propped up by the US. And gradually I think within 2 years, I had left the pastorate and worked full-time in Palestine. It just was like a calling for me. And I want to end this part and turn to a section from the book. I've titled the book, Glory to God in the Lowest. Now, my wife didn't like that that title. She said, she's a Muslim and fairly secular and doesn't really get theology very much. So I tried to explain it to her. She said, no, you need something else. But I stuck with this because in successive trips, I met Naim Atik and several other Palestinians and began to read liberation theology, Palestinian liberation theology. And Latin American theology preceded it, but there are certain themes in liberation theology. The priests, and Catherine, you can probably help me with this if people have questions. Priests were doing studies in base communities, small communities where everyone was a teacher. We listened to each other. One of the themes is also the preferential option of the poor, that God cares for the broken and the poor. And isn't that the model that Jesus sets? Contrast that to this white Christian nationalism. Think of Matthew 25. Where were you when I was thirsty? Did you bring me drink? When I was hungry, did you bring me food? When, you might say, when my home was demolished, did you help me rebuild or find housing? Even as you do it unto the least of these, my brethren, you do it to me. That's where I got this title from. It's a flip on the Annunciation when the angels on Christmas sing glory to God in the highest, peace on earth, goodwill to all. Jesus was the opposite. It's not hierarchical, it's learning. So I have been taught, first by the Black church, folks who have been victims of racism, then the Palestinians and so many others, to honor them and center their voices. So that's what I'm trying to do in this book. Center voices of those who have been victimized, and they have so much to teach us, and they call us back to what we should be doing justice. Well, let me move to, by the way, I've got little quotes at the beginning of each chapter, and one of them, when I got to seminary and got into the anti-war movement, then learned liberation theology, coming from my conservative evangelical background. Education consists mainly of what we have unlearned. So my whole life journey has kind of been unlearning, trying to stay open, learning from the broken, the poor about justice, and then be in solidarity. So here's the chapter I'd like to close with. 2 years later, I made 3 trips to Lebanon and Palestine. And I was there with a group of, in June, I took a group of American relief and development groups. I wanted them to see the refugee camps and hopefully take on ministry and work. World Vision, Mercy Corps, there were several others. So we got caught in the bombing of Beirut. We were trapped for a week, and that's a real awakening. But then we were able to get away, and you have this guilt. What is it, the Stockholm Syndrome? Where we so identified with the people that we felt guilty leaving. But we were told, we want you to get out so you can tell what's really happening, because the media and our government was not telling us. So we went back and did that. And then 3 of us returned with proposals to try to do something. 2 of them, one was to work with the Red Crescent in health care at different hospitals. Another was a literacy project that Mercy Corps was going to do. And I took a proposal I wrote, to develop a relationship between evangelicals and Middle East Christians and Palestinians. And that eventually did take off. So my two friends and I arrived, we left the United States on a Thursday in mid-September, and it happened to be the night the new president of Lebanon was assassinated, blown up in his compound. Bashir Gemayel was his name. And we didn't know, wow, should we hold up? We said, no, we're going to be okay. Let's just go. So we arrived, and you had to land in Cyprus because the airport in Beirut had been bombed by Israel. It was destroyed. So we had to take a boat. So we rendezvoused at Cyprus Airport, Larnaca, jumped in a taxi cab, and headed for the boat. And within a few minutes, it was 6 o'clock Middle East time, and the first announcement of the Sabra Shatila massacre came over the BBC. And this was a serious massacre. So we, the cab driver said, you guys are going nowhere, just let's get a hotel. So we did. Then we were able to take the boat over the next day, arrived early in the morning, and the massacre ended on a Sunday afternoon, and we were there Monday. We got down to the Middle East office, and Gabi Habib, our host, said, I want you guys to get right over to the massacre so you can see what has happened here. So we did, and we walked by the tower that Israel had as a command post where it was directing these Lebanese militias to go in, and they had leveled a huge two refugee camps, Sabra and Shatila. As we walked in, we walked right by the Israel post where they had binoculars. They could see everything that was going on. And we were handed a handkerchief doused in cologne. It was in the mid-90s, humid, and the smell of death was so intense, you would get sick if you didn't have that over you. So that's why we went in. And we heard these blood-curdling screams because families were just coming back the first day to see if anyone survived or what was left. They were literally pulling pieces of body. I witnessed it. Pieces of bodies out that had been hatcheted with machetes. So, here, let me get to... Here we are. It was Monday morning, September 20th, 1982. I was sitting on a pile of dirt from a mass grave as we watched Red Cross and Red Crescent workers bury Palestinians below us. When I arrived at Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in southern Beirut, I was quickly overcome by the emotional overload and the intense heat. Palestinian families were returning for the first time since the massacre ended the previous day, and were dreading finding the remains of loved ones still under the rubble from their bulldozed homes. A few minutes earlier, I watched as workers pulled the decaying bodies of two small children from the rubble. I saw this. Their mother cried out in Arabic, "Why, O Allah, why us?" The piercing screams cut through to my heart and soul. Then I saw a parade of body bags, possibly 300 to 400, taking their victims to their final resting place. We had to cover our mouth and nose with handkerchiefs doused in cheap cologne to offset the intense stench of death that permeated the destroyed camp. I'd never witnessed such a concentration of death and suffering in one place, and hope I never will again. I had to sit down for a moment and found a dirt pile where a group of French journalists were sitting. I heard the woman beside me crying, and I asked how she was holding up. She said through her tears, "I've been covering this god-awful war all summer, and now this massacre. This is beyond my comprehension. Then she asked me the dreaded question, where are you from? I hesitated. I was embarrassed because I knew the United States signed a treaty 3 weeks earlier to protect the Palestinians, and the U.S. pulled the Marines out. Sharon negotiated that withdrawal of the Marines and put pressure on the U.S. Ariel Sharon, who was a defense minister, and the U.S. conceded, pulled the Marines out. Then they brought the militia in and coordinated the massacre. We were responsible. So I said, I'm sorry to admit I'm from the United States. She responded, you're not alone. France has equal responsibility for that betrayal. We too signed that treaty. But perhaps that's why you and I are here, to witness this. Our conversation was interrupted by another blood-curdling scream from a mother or daughter when the body of a child was pulled out, wailing in Arabic, why, oh Allah, why the Palestinians, why? We bowed our heads and wept. I asked the journalist, do you have any idea how many bodies are beneath us? And she said, I lost count. It's going to be at least 300 to 400. But look to your right. And she pointed, they're digging another mass grave bigger than this one. My God, this is beyond belief, I said. At that moment, I saw a Muslim sheikh walk by, and I excused myself and ran to catch up with him. I extended my condolences to the sheikh. I asked if he was the sheikh at the local mosque. His English was excellent as he said, yes, I am. Many of these people who you see below you were with me at Friday prayers just 3 days ago. Now look at what's happened to them. I asked if he had any idea how many had been killed. He said, the workers will never be able to find all of the victims. Yes, there's mass graves here, but I, with my own eyes on Friday afternoon, saw them lining men up against the wall and machine gunning them to death, and then loading their bodies on trucks. They're buried all over Lebanon. They'll never find them. I shook my head. I thanked him for taking time with me. Then he asked me where I was from. Again, I was about to say Canada. I had to be honest, though. I said, I'm from the United States, and their blood is on our hands. Yes, the blood is on your hands as Americans, he said. Then he surprised me. He said, I thank Allah you are here today, my friend, witnessing what has happened. Now, you must return home and tell what you have seen. This is all we ask. Go home and tell the truth. So that was my calling, and that's what I've tried to do. Thank you. Well, we can take a few questions if you want. I was jumping around a little bit. Yes. No. It's my wife and I just came back from Palestine, Israel, and they are all saying this is the worst situation they have ever been in politically since the Nakba. These refugees in Lebanon, most of them are trapped in these camps. There are most of the jobs available, they're prevented by law from having. They can drive cabs, some of them run little shacks and restaurants, but they're really in the worst shape of all the Palestinians, those left in Lebanon. And you know, there was just an election in Israel, and it was, imagine, it was as if the far right-wing nationalists won everything here. You know, all the Trump supporting candidates won in Israel. You know, they won the far right with Netanyahu. And there are now people in government, Ben Gvir is one of them, who has openly called for the Palestinians to be driven out of their land. This is their land. And Israel is taking and building settlements from them every day. They get expanded. So the Palestinians are saying, we are in our worst situation ever. So that is what has happened, and we finance it. Yeah, let me just get 2 examples, then I'll come back to you. Every day, and we heard it happen, there are an average of 2 children picked up by the military. They're often beaten, and then they're taken to prison, and they can be put in prison and held without any charges in what's called administrative detention. And the grandson of someone, a founder of Sabeel with Naim Atik, the grandson, his name is Shadi Khoury, 16 years old, honor student at Friends School in Ramallah, the best school in Palestine, was picked up. The military, they surrounded the house. A number of military came in massed, knocked the door down at 5 a.m., pulled him out of bed, told him to undress. He refused. So they beat him up and broke his nose, dragged him off to the Jeep, and a trail of blood followed him right out the house. And they beat him again in front of his parents. Now, there is a bill in Congress, and I know some of you have been active calling people to vote. There's a bill number, House Resolution 2950, I believe is a designation, against this practice. Betty McCollum from Minneapolis is the leader of it. It's got about 32 people on it, and this would be something that you could get active in, contact your member of the House, even Senate. I was in Atlanta last week. Yeah, HR 2590. I think I've got that right. I mean, it'll continue through the year, and then when there's a new Congress, it'll get a new number in January, okay? But right now, that's one you could activate. And last week I spoke and mentioned this in Atlanta, and a Quaker was there, and he was an archaeologist and has just gotten turned on about justice in Palestine. So he set up a meeting with John Ossoff, the senator, who is Jewish and is very open on this issue. So I arranged for Shadi's mother, the boy in prison, his mother, to hook up with Ossoff's office on Zoom, and she gave personal testimony on Wednesday. So that's the kind of thing that can be done, but we have a lot of information. Defense of Children International is in charge of all of this, and the American Friends Committee are very, very active. We've lobbied our Congress, and we've gotten about 3 out of 5 of our Chicago members to sign on. Catherine? Oh, yeah. 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 We're told that if you could get up to around 60, then they would hold hearings. So that's the hope. So this will go on, but that's one, here's a specific case, children. And my wife's nephew was told by his mom one night, this was a year ago, he lives right next to Ramallah, a major city in the West Bank. His mom said, "Oh, we're out of bread. Go down to the baker," which was 2 blocks away, get some bread. So he came out of the bakery with the bread. There was a skirmish with kids going on with the military. He got scared and ran and hid. They grabbed him. He was put in prison for 8 months with no charge. And his parents, I know the kid, he was apolitical, a really good student. So this is, every night, there's an average of 2 picked up like this. So this is something, this actually violates international law and violates human rights law. And there are bills in Congress. One is called the U.S. Arms Export Control Act, and the other is the Leahy bill that says if a country who receives U.S. military and international assistance violates international law, the funding can be reduced. But that has never been invoked in the case of Israel. And this is bad for Jews. This is bad for the whole idea of Israel. And Jewish Voice for Peace is very active on this bill, as are a number of others. I'm sorry. Okay, the gentleman had a question first, and then we'll come here. Really good question. I don't know if I have a clear answer, but since '77, there's been a growth of the Likud party, which is a type of, it's called revisionist Zionism, which is the real aggressive form. All of the land is ours, and we're going to put in settlements that there's no dispute. It's much more aggressive, much more militant. And Netanyahu comes out of that tradition. And this has been growing in popularity, particularly as the settlements grow. And the settlers, this is settler colonialism and steroids. The settlers now are armed and they're trained and they're very, very militant. And they are a political force. And for Netanyahu to really win control, you have to cobble together a coalition. Israel has 120 seats in its parliament, the Knesset. So you have to get at least 61 to control. So in order to get that, he made a deal with the farthest extreme. I don't know if you've ever heard of Meir Kahane, an extremely militant rabbi who wrote a book called They Must Go, which is drive all the Palestinians out, we'll take over. These two who head this, I forget which party it is, there's 2 parties that gave Netanyahu the leadership to become prime minister and control the government. They come out of Kahane's tradition. So that is really, unfortunately, Israel is growing more in that direction. And then this election, Meretz, which is a Israeli human rights party, didn't even get enough votes to have 1 Knesset member. They didn't reach the threshold to have 1. And the Labor Party, which used to be in control, dropped. They didn't even get 10 members of the Knesset. They used to run the government. Ben Gurion, Rabin, they were all labor. So, it's a grim situation, but Palestinians say, the mask is off. This is where Zionism is going. It's this extreme ultranationalism. It's dangerous, and the U.S. better wake up. Now, we're really concerned that Biden doesn't get it. He is a passionate pro-Zionist, person, and I don't know if he, and many of the moderates will stand up, but that's where we come in. Question here, and then we'll go to the back.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a pretty uninformed question.
Oh, don't worry.
This is 4.0. I'd like to know your view of why we are so supportive of Israel.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a couple, and then we'll take. Well, no, I think initially, when Israel was established as a state, there were several options on the table. And one was to partition Palestine. You know, there had been fighting, there had been all this colonization. The Palestinian population was still 67% Arab in that territory. So there was one proposal, was to have one democracy where everyone would be equal under the law. The Zionist movement did not want that. They wanted to partition the country. And in the partition decision by the United Nations, this was the first decision that the United Nations made when it was established in 47, November 29th, 1947. They voted to partition, and they gave the smaller number, the Jewish population, 54%. And the Palestinians got 40%. So they got less, and the coastal area was all given to Israel. And the U.S. was the major lobbying force for that to go through. We strong-armed some smaller countries to get the vote. And a lot of it was because there was a strong lobby. And then that lobby grew and has tremendous power. It's stronger than the National Rifle Association. And what's what? To have Israel have sufficient U.S. support, financial, economic, military, so they have become the strongest military power in the Middle East. They have the fifth AIPAC, and there are several others. Anti-Defamation League, they all lobby for Israel and get tremendous. I mean, Israel receives what's reported by the GAO, General Accounting Office, $4.2 billion a year. Biden gave them an extra $1 billion, so they got $5 billion last year. But this is there's a deep commitment, a deep lobby. Some of it is because of the Holocaust. Other is that Israel plays a military role for the U.S. as our guardian in that area. Now, before it was Iran under the Shah, we had a dual containment thing for the oil. When the Shah went down, Israel became more important. So there's that. And the U.S. protects Israel from international law. There's been, I think, somebody could research this, I think there's been 47 vetoes at the UN when the UN has passed a bill that it's illegal to steal land and build settlements. U.S. vetoes it. There's been a bill about this children's thing. U.S. vetoes it. So we are a protector for Israel at the UN. There's one in the back, and then. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Oh, it's a book that thick. I've read it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and sometimes you gotta be careful how you talk about this, because people say, oh, if you're criticizing Israel, you're anti-Semitic. No, I'm sorry. But there's Israel now and the lobby are pushing a bill to have a. Did this go off? There it is. A definition of anti-Semitism that was concocted by the IHRC, the International Holocaust something committee. And in that bill, 7 points are made. 6 of them are I can agree with. We do not want anti-Semitic racism in any form to go forward. But there's one, I think it's item 6, that says criticism of Israel can be anti-Semitic. And this has now been adopted in a number of states. It passed in Maryland on Wednesday, and it's coming your way. Okay? Now, BDS, boycott, divestment, sanction. I am a strong supporter of BDS. Naeem Atik wrote a pamphlet on why this is a legitimate, nonviolent form of protest for justice. For me, I can add it's a Christian form of stewardship. Like, I'm not going to buy Hewlett Packard because Hewlett Packard puts the chip and works with Israel technology, so Israel monitors the behavior and whereabouts of every Palestinian, and they can detain them at checkpoints. So Hewlett Packard works closely with Israel in all that technology. So I'm not buying a Hewlett Packard computer until they get out. For a while, remember SodaStream, which was promoted by, well, I can't remember her name, a couple of actresses, and was a big deal, but it was manufactured in a settlement on stolen Palestinian land. So we boycotted SodaStream, and eventually they moved. But there are over 375 products like this. Sabra hummus. Yeah. American Friends Service Committee has it. And I think you could Google why profit. Who profits? That's it. Thank you, Vivian. Who profits? Google that, you'll get the list. So this is now claimed by the Israeli right wing to be anti-Semitic. Although Israel boycotts constantly other nations and has done it with a number of the Arab countries. So for me, it's also an act of stewardship. I do not want to profit from another people's suffering. It's as simple as that. And the BDS movement was initiated as a nonviolent form of pursuing justice to bring economic pressure on Israel, but also to make a moral statement. And this was done with South Africa. And the Jewish community is really strong on that. I remember years ago, you probably went through, I had my little list when I went shopping of products to boycott from South Africa to put pressure on the apartheid regime. Yeah, and it worked. But this is going to be a longer one. Desmond Tutu, he came to Palestine and he said, what's going on here is far worse than anything we had to deal with. This is apartheid on steroids. And it is. Now we're being told, don't use the apartheid word. It makes us feel bad, some of the people. Well, I'm sorry. In Chicago, we're starting a campaign, and I think it's going to spread because a lot of the churches, Jewish Voice for Peace, American Muslims for Palestine, are getting involved. We are going to do a study, have a toolkit with resources, analysis on developing apartheid-free communities. You would sign a statement, a mission statement. We're going to take it to churches, synagogues, mosques, universities, city councils, and use the apartheid word, because 6 human rights organizations have done definitive studies and said, outlining clearly with documentation, this is apartheid. In fact, B'Tselem, the leading Israeli human rights organization, issued a report a year ago, said, oh, help me with the title. Yeah, this is apartheid from the river to the sea, which means not only the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem, but inside Israel. And this is the Israeli human rights group, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Defense of Children. Harvard Law School issued a statement on this. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. That is local. These are your friends. We have 4 or 5 from Nor NorCal Sabile. Yeah. Yeah. Naima Teague started Sabile, is still with it, although retired. So this is like the chapter of Sabile here in the Bay Area. Amen. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for that support. Yeah. I, oh, go ahead. I wanted to try to remember. Thank you for being with us. Yeah, absolutely. I left that out. How could I? Yes, the Christian Zionist support is big. And it's, in fact, remember when Israel moved, the US moved the embassy to Jerusalem, violating international law by all standards? The Christian Zionist lobby, Christians United for Israel, was heavily involved. And Trump, on his campaign, his second campaign in 2020, made a statement in Wisconsin, I think it was at La Crosse, where he said, "Thank you, evangelicals. Now remember to vote for me because thanks to you, we moved the embassy for you." Yeah, so it was a direct kind of result. And that was like a taboo politically, forever. But now Trump did it, and the Christian Zionists were the major supporters. But quietly, so were the major Israeli lobby. They were behind it. And that was, again, Netanyahu. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Right. Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah. You're absolutely correct. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yes. Wow. Yeah. 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 Wow. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Mhm. Yes. Now they're inflicting it. Yeah. Some people have used the imagery, the abuser, or the child abuser, or the wife abuser, the abused will grow up and abuse as well, unless there's intervention and therapy. So we need that intervention. But thank you for saying that. I think it's still true that the Palestinians have a higher PhD per capita than any other Arab country. and they're right behind Israel. And you got PhDs driving cabs now, and they can't find work. But anyway, I want to end with one hopeful note. Sabeel and Naeem's successor, and Naeem Atik is involved in this. Sabeel is organizing medical care and medical insurance for the West Bank Palestinians. They don't have it. So they are now up to about 9,000 members, and doctors and nurses are providing care at a reduced cost. People are now paying into it, and this is self-sufficiency. Said, we don't get it. The Palestinian Authority is really, it's a negative force. Often they're collaborating. In fact, Shadi, the case I talked about, he was beaten up by the Palestinian Authority to try to get information out of him a month before Israel picked him up. Yeah, the Palestinian Authority are doing part of Israel's police work. So the Palestinian Authority is not providing that. They're co-opted very much by Israel and the US. So people are having to develop their own medical insurance provision. So they're doing that. I don't know. I would suspect, yeah. And they're in Gaza, and Gaza is in worse shape than the West Bank. Well, we should probably end here. But keep hope alive. The people there are resisting, and I want to close with, remember the parable of the unjust judge? Many have heard this. There was a judge, I think this is in Luke chapter 18. My mind is a little fuzzy this morning. But Jesus teaches this parable. He says, once there was this unjust judge who respected neither God nor people. And there was a widow who was dealt an injustice. And the widow would come before the judge every day and bang on his chambers. And he would not do anything. He ignored her. But she kept coming again and again. And finally, the judge said, give this woman justice. She's wearing me down. That woman must be our model. It's the Palestinians look to this. They will not give up, and we must stand with them. So thanks for being such an attentive audience this morning.
Can we purchase any of your books?
Oh, thank you. I forgot. I happen to have a few here. I'll be happy to sign them. Glory to God in the lowest. They are a bargain at $20 each. Oh, beautiful. Yeah, I do. There you go. Pastors. Wonderful. We may have to go out to the car. Is the car nearby? It's 20? Just a $20 bill. One crisp 20 will do it. Thank you very much. Thanks for your question and your comment. Yes, I couldn't miss it.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I've been. Yeah.
Great. Well,
Some families.
thanks for picking up that issue on children. I saw you taking that. Do something.
Yeah, I mean, I knew it was a problem, but I didn't know that there was actually something we can do about it, so that's always refreshing.
And the fact that you were calling people. Put some of those people. So thank you so much.
I don't have a $20 bill, but that'll be the same.
Oh,
Thank
that
you
is
very much.
for sure the same. Thanks very much. Yes, I will be happy.
So Naeem's son, one of Naeem's sons, was at a church in Bethesda, Maryland.
Oh,
that
I
my-
was with them in
Um,
September.
So my brother had been going to that church for a while. So, yeah, my brother lives in Presbyterian.
He interviewed me on the book. We had a great evening
Yeah?
at the church.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What's your